Please welcome Aaron.
Thank you for coming. Thanks especially to Jason and to Chris for hosting this event. This is an excerpt from my novel in progress, from the first chapter, and it's called They Have Numbered All My Bones. So far in the first chapter, a hand has been floating over the town of Spoken, Texas, and it uncovers two teens, 16-year-old David Young and 18-year-old John Nix, who are about to break into the school chapel at St. Peter's, and they are going to uncover the truth about a rumor that a severed hand has been kept locked up in the tabernacle. And once they find that it's empty, John starts to press David as to why he's so uncomfortable with breaking school rules, and he begins to suspect something that would compromise David's reputation as a perfect kind of goody two-shoes kid. And David starts to get uncomfortable and excuses himself by going to the bathroom, which is where this section begins. He reached for the lever to flush the toilet when the door to the restroom creaked open. The quieted thud of footsteps on the checkered tile lifted the silence that had hung over the room like heavy drapes. David listened as the footsteps approached the urinals. John? David didn't recognize the way his voice resounded off the tile. The sound of a zipper being unfastened made David shiver. This was followed by an all too familiar hissing sound. David cleared his throat. Words were lodged there, and he had to force them out. You're right. I'm not the perfect guy everyone thinks I am. But I know you're not who you pretend to be either. The trickling stopped, ceasing with a final drop, and the flushing of the urinal filled the room with a sound that resembled the gargling of spit. When it was over, the room was steeped in a silence that hung upon him even more heavily than before. David stared at the hands of his watch. It took him a few moments to realize that they had actually stopped moving. Time held its breath at 1:59 a.m. Did you hear what I said? David asked. There came no response, which worried him deeply. He was going too far and he knew it. Had he misinterpreted what John suspected of him? The shoes backed away from the urinal until they were standing right outside David's stall. Their polished toes peeked under the door. There was something off about those black Oxfords, David thought. His own, like John's, were caked in mud, but these were miraculously clean. Without warning, an ink-black eye pressed close to the slit between the door and its frame, peering in. But John's eyes were gray. David jumped in place on the toilet seat and pulled up his pants. What are you doing? He shouted. Who are you? The stranger's eye remained fixed to the narrow gap, blinking. He stood there completely still, and then his voice said, knock, knock. That he didn't actually knock terrified David. John! David shouted, realizing he was actually screaming for help. He was trapped in the stall with no way out. He cannot hear you, said the man. Despite the great acoustics of the room, his voice sounded eerily flat and muffled, as though it were obstructed by something David couldn't see. Look, I'll be going now. I'm not here for any funny business. At David's words, the man laughed, a giggling laugh that ended as abruptly as it began. I'm afraid it is not that simple. At those words, the bathroom changed. It felt like someone had smothered the room, cutting off oxygen. A strange, slimy liquid dripped from the ceiling that stung David's skin on contact and left behind red welts. Suddenly, hot, stagnant air began to blow from the vents, and the walls pooled with perspiration. On the stall wall beside his right shoulder, a wad of chewing gum expanded before his eyes, 10, nearly 20 times its original size, until it covered not only the stall, but parts of the floor, too. Worse, the gum had an uncanny likeness to living tissue. David curled up into a ball and tried not to touch it. He then stood up on the toilet seat and considered a plan of escape. Without a word, the man backed away from the stall. What's happening? Where are we? It does not matter, the man answered. You are safe here. This is a place where he cannot touch you. He? Had this man overheard him and John talking in the halls? Who are you? What are you? Standing on the toilet seat, David leaned over and pressed his eye to the slit. He saw a man standing in the middle of the now dimly lit room in a short-brimmed bowler hat, straightening out a nice midnight blue suit and a red silk tie. He had thick arms, plain features, and pale lips, though no matter how David shifted, he couldn't get a good enough look at the man's entire face. His skin was flushed pink and wet with sweat. The man reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a red handkerchief. He wiped his forehead and tucked it back into his pocket, then folded his hands behind his back, smiling a stiff, unmoving smile that remained plastered to his face. I have many names, but you can call me your special friend, said the man. Like a ventriloquist, he spoke through that grin, though it wasn't right to call it that. David wondered what the man's hands were doing behind his back. What makes you my friend? The man laughed the same giggling laugh as before. Because, David Young, you and I go way back. David gulped. His mouth was dry, void of spit. He didn't know how this man knew his name. He'd never seen him before in his life. The stranger's smile seemed to spread even wider, but that was definitely not possible. He stepped forward. You were about to make an awful mistake tonight. That is why I am here, to intervene. The man withdrew one hand from behind his back. It held a sugar cube, resting on his flat, fat palm. He polished the cube on the sleeve of his jacket, before placing it carefully on the tip of his tongue. What kind of mistake? David tried to keep him talking, mostly because he was afraid of what the man might do next. But he seemed no longer interested in conversation. The man did nothing until the sugar cube dissolved in his mouth. Then he licked each of his stubby, swollen fingers. Next, he extended his index finger and pointed it at the stall door. He twisted it in the air, turning it like a key. David heard a deep groan coming from behind the walls. The whole room shook. He jumped down from the toilet seat and braced himself against the stall walls. It was as if the plates of the earth were shifting. The bolt that kept the stall door locked now suddenly bent backwards, like a broken finger. The door swung open. David rushed forward to barricade the door. If this is about breaking into the church, we're sorry. We didn't mean to do anything wrong. David heard how desperate he sounded, as well as how honest. This is about something much worse. The man peeled off his suit jacket and hung it over the paper towel dispenser. It didn't slouch or hang like normal fabric, but remained completely stiff and unwrinkled. There are things out there, wicked things, David, that would love to get their hands on you. But I am your salvation. I can protect you, if it's not too late. The words spilled into David's ears like drool dripping directly from the man's pale lips. Protect me from what? David's voice cracked. The man extended his open hand. Come out of that stall. Sorry, but that's not what I had in mind. The man sighed and began to roll up his sleeves past each elbow. Fine, stay here. I have nowhere else to be. I can wait all night. David clenched his fist. Tears clouded his eyes. Why are you doing this? I cannot allow you to leave with this gentleman tonight. It is not safe. However, you may leave with me if you prefer. We have much to discuss. And if I refuse? The man's horrible smile was gone and now replaced by an equally exaggerated frown. Then I will drag you out. David took his eye away from the slit. He tried to convince himself that this man wasn't a real threat, that there was actually something quite comical about this. Maybe he was just an invitation of his imagination, a fantasy, right? David returned to the slit in the doorframe and saw that the man was now stooping over, examining something on the checkered tile floor. David shifted to get a better look. From there he saw the man in the bowler hat lift up the floor. It bunched in his hands like a sagging cloth. A prayer escaped David's lips, and he meant every word of it. Holy shit. The man yanked the tile back, as if pulling a tablecloth out from underneath a fully set table. so that everything in the room remained standing upright, except for David, who lost his footing. With the tile gone and the concrete and pipes exposed, David tried to cling to the toilet bowl, but his sweaty hands couldn't grip the slick porcelain. He kicked and screamed as the man seized him by the ankles and dragged him out of the stall. "Wait," David screamed. "Can't we talk about this?" But the time for supplication was over. David tried to get up, but the man pinned him down to the concrete. The slouching tile floor was gathered around them like the slough of some giant snake with massive scales. The man placed his hand on David's chest and pressed hard, crushing him. "You cannot resist me," he said, spitting in David's face. "Heaven is mine." David tried to fight back. The man pressed his hand even harder into David's chest. He felt his ribs bearing the full brunt of the force. The man's face twisted in exertion and frustration. Whatever he was trying to do wasn't working. For a brief moment, from behind the mangled screen of their limbs, David saw something in the man's face that almost resembled fear. At the next moment, the man abandoned whatever he was trying to do with David's chest and seized his neck. He slammed David's skull against the concrete. David struggled, but it was no use. The man was too fast, too strong. He seemed to anticipate David's moments before he made them. So David accepted his fate. What choice did he have? When the man punched his face, breaking his nose and spraying his crisp white shirt with blood, David turned the other cheek. The man began to crush his throat. As David lost oxygen, he wondered if dying really had to take so long. David floated out of his body. He watched from the ceiling as the man crouched over him and checked his pulse. He was still alive, still breathing. The man stood up and carefully unrolled his sleeves and unbuttoned them at the wrist. With the same red handkerchief as before, he wiped the blood from his knuckles and patted his forehead dry. He fixed his tie and examined his appearance in the mirror from afar, then turned back to David's body. "You are going to be a bigger nuisance than I thought," he said, then kicked over David's unresponsive body with a polished toe of his shoe, rolling him onto his stomach and into a puddle of piss at the base of the toilet. Then the world went black.